have been discussing about early Greek philosophers, and we have also touched upon the school of atomism with Democritus and Epicurus, who technically belongs more towards the later Middle Greek philosophy. So today we will be discussing about Middle Greek philosophers, since we are done with a whole bunch of the early Greek philosophers and some bit of the later Middle Greek philosophers. And to begin this, we will be giving an introduction as to who were the Middle Greek philosophers. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, to quickly revisit, early Greek philosophers have been the pre-Socratics, who were from basically 6th to 5th century BCE. They were called pre-Socratics because they lived before or around Socrates. And technically, we talk about the Milesian school whenever we are talking about the pre-Socratics, for their focus had been on natural principles. Thales, the father of philosophy, had talked about water as the first principle or arche. Anaximander had talked about something which he calls as the apeiron or the infinite as the source. Anaximenes had talked about air as the principle or the arche. Pythagoras or the Pythagoreans had talked about number and harmony as the structure of reality. Heraclitus had talked about flux, fire, unity of opposites for the same. Parmenides and Eleatics, Zeno, Melissus had talked about the concept of being, which is the one unchanging, denied motion and plurality. Empedocles had discussed at length about the four elements, earth, water, air, fire, and moved by love and strife. Anaxagoras had talked about infinite seeds, nous, mind, as cosmic order. Leucippus and Democritus had talked about atomism and atoms plus void. So, one important or interesting fact about the early Greek philosophers were that they had shifted from mythos to logos, the mythical explanations, to rational natural explanations, and each proposed a direct arche or a fundamental principle of the cosmos. Now, in today's lecture, our focus would be on the Middle Greek philosophers. And when I talk about the Middle Greek philosophers, though technically this term would be contestable, since there is usually the early Greek philosophers and later Greek philosophers, but I have tried in this lecture to come up with the intersectional points of the early and the later and coined the term Middle Greek philosophers for the same. They are the classical philosophers 5th to 4th century BCE, and this period centers on Socrates, Plato, Aristotle and their contemporaries. Contemporaries, sophists, like Protagoras, Gorgias, who would use rhetoric, relativism, human-centered thought. Socrates, 469 to 399 BCE, who talked about ethics, virtue, examined life. Plato, 427 to 347 BCE, who talked about the theory of forms, was a rationalist metaphysics, soul's immortality, ideal state. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, who gave a systematic philosophy, logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, biology. So, with the Middle Greek philosophers, what we see is they responded to the pre-Socratic problem of nature by shifting focus towards ethics, towards knowledge, and towards politics. Plato took from Heraclitus the concept of flux and Parmenides the concept of unity to build his theory of forms. Aristotle critiqued Plato but systematized and preserved much pre-Socratic and Platonic thought. We also have then the late Greek philosophers, the Hellenistic and the Roman periods, the 3rd century BCE, 6th century BCE. After Aristotle, philosophy had spread across the Mediterranean with focus on ethics and living well. Epicurus, Lucretius, whose philosophy was largely on atomism, hedonistic ethics, pleasure is equal to absence of pain. We also had Stoics, the Zeno of Citilium, Sisyphus, Epictetus, Marcus, whose logos as cosmic reason, virtue as the only good, fate and providence. Skeptics, Philo and Sextus Empiricus, who had suspended judgment and tranquility. Cynics, Diogenes of Sinope, who lived simply against convention. Neoplatonists like Plotinus, Proclus, later influencing Augustine with a mystical return to the one, synthesis of Plato and Aristotle, and the intersectionality of Epicureans and Stoics both answered the question of how to live without fear in an uncertain world, but gave opposite answers, pleasures versus virtue. And skeptics challenged both by doubting the possibility of certainty, and Neoplatonists reinterpreted Plato and Aristotle in mystical ways, bridging Greek philosophy with emerging Christian thought. Now, the intersectionality of across early to middle to later philosopher we see has been on the theme from nature to ethics. Early philosophers' question like what is the universe made of? Middle philosophers' question would be how should human live? What is justice? What is truth? What is knowledge? Later philosophers' question was more towards how to find tranquility or virtue in a turbulent world. And then again, from unity to multiplicity. Pre-Socratics are split between unity, for example, Parmenides, and flux, Heraclitus. Plato reconciled by positing two levels of reality, forms versus sensible world. Aristotle grounded philosophy in this world, substance, form plus matter. Hellenistic schools turned focus to the self and society. Now, the intersectionality across early, middle, later, we see the continuities of atomism of Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius, the rational cosmos of Heraclitus's logos to Stoics to later Christian theology, and Platonic idealism of Plato to middle Platonists, Neoplatonists to Augustine. Now, early pre-Socratics, natural philosophy, archaea of the cosmos. The middle is the classical, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, who talked about ethics, politics, knowledge. The later has been the Hellenistic and the Roman period, who talked about Stoics, Epicureans, skeptics, Neoplatonists, and practical philosophy, inner peace, synthesis. They form a continuous dialogue. They earlier asked the question, what is reality? The middle Greek philosophers asked, how do we know and how do we live? The later Greek philosophers asked, how to live wisely in a changing, turbulent world? So, if we look at the common features, or if we attempt to look at the common features of middle Greek philosophers, we will see a shift from nature to human concerns. Early philosophers, the pre-Socratics, had asked about what is the world made of. Some said water, some fire, atoms, and so on. Middle philosophers turned to what is a good life, what is justice, what is knowledge. The second feature is perhaps the centrality of ethics, where Socrates' virtue is equivalent to knowledge, focuses on moral character. Plato's justice, the good, the soul's well-being is yet another emphasis on that. Aristotle's happiness or eudaimonia, true virtue, is yet the other focus, and the common concern is how to live a flourishing, meaningful life. Now, the search for universal truths, they moved beyond relativism of the sophists who said man is the measure of all things, and they tried to ground knowledge in reason, not convention. They believe in objective standards, truth, justice, virtue, forms. The use of reason and dialogue, philosophy as a rational argument, not myth. Socrates' dialectic, question and answer, and Plato written dialogues showing reasoning, and Aristotle's systematic logic and analysis. about the integration of knowledge. They did not separate philosophy, science, politics and art, and Socrates ethics and civic duty, Plato metaphysics, politics and education, for Aristotle logic, biology, metaphysics, and their aim was a comprehensive worldview. The focus on the soul and human nature, Socrates talked about the care of the soul, Plato the tripartite, soul or immortality. Aristotle, soul as the form of the body, faculties of life. The common idea is the understanding of the soul is equivalent to understanding the person. Further, about a political engagement, all these tied philosophy into polis or city-state. Philosophy was not abstract only, it was about forming just citizens and communities. The teacher-student lineage. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, so we see a living tradition of questioning and refinement and not isolated systems. So, if we look at the PPT here, we see the theme Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the major middle Greek philosophers' focus theme has been on philosophy. For Socrates, it has been ethics and virtue of examined life. Plato had said about the reality of forms, justice, knowledge, ideal state. For Aristotle, it was systematic study of all fields, logic, ethics, politics, biology, metaphysics. Method has been dialectic for Socrates, Plato, dialogues, Aristotle, logic and classifications. The view of knowledge for Socrates has been that knowledge is equivalent to virtue, ignorance is equivalent to vice. Plato, true knowledge is knowledge of eternal forms or unchanging realities. For Aristotle, it is knowledge from experience plus reason and emphasized on empirical observation. View of the soul, Socrates talked about care of the soul, which is the highest duty and immortal. Plato had talked about the tripartite soul, reason, spirit, appetite, or soul and immortal. And for Aristotle, it was soul, which is form of the body, faculties, nutrition, perception, reason, and not separate from body. About ethics, Socrates talks about virtue is the only true good, unexamined life is not worth living. For Plato, it was good life is equivalent to contemplation of forms, especially the form of the good. For Aristotle, it was eudaimonia, which is flourishing, activity of soul in accord with virtue, with moderation, or the golden mean. For politics, for Socrates, it was critique of the Athenian democracy executed by the polis. For Plato, it was the republic, philosopher, kings should rule, just state, the mirrors, just soul. For Aristotle, politics is humans are political animals, best state balances classes, practical governance. And the legacy we see for Socrates, moral seriousness, method of questioning. Plato is idealism, theory of forms, inspired later Platonism and Neoplatonism. For Aristotle, it is empiricism, systematic science, foundation of logic and natural philosophy. So, the common features have been that all had cared about ethics, virtue and the soul, and all tied philosophy to the polis or the city-state. And all the middle Greek philosophers believed in reason as the path to truth, and they formed a lineage, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. Further, when we compare that with the later dialogues of critical or the late period, we see that these dialogues show Plato as an older philosopher who has been more analytical, less reliant on myths, and more technical in dialectic. They often critiqued or refined their earlier doctrines, especially the theory of forms, and some of the important or distinguished late dialogues have been Parmenides, which is a critical examination of the theory of forms, Theaetetus, that explores knowledge or epistemology, what is knowledge, Sophists about who investigates being, not being, and the nature of the sophists, statesman, the politicus, that asks what makes a true statesman, Philebus, that examines pleasure, knowledge, and the good life, Timaeus, that talks about cosmology, creation of the universe, role of the demiurge, Critias that talks about the unfinished dialogue contains the Atlantis. Myth, Laws that talks about the long systematic dialogue on law, politics and the second best state, that is the without philosopher kings. And the features of the late dialogues where they have been less Socratic, more didactic, they have been more longer, complex and heavy on classification and definition, and they blend on metaphysics, cosmology and practical politics. There are also certain dialogues which are called as the dialogues of doubtful authenticity, which is in a way spurious or disputed. These ancient sources like Thrasyllus and modern scholarship agree that not all works attributed to Plato were really his, generally considered spurious not by Plato but dialogues like Alcibiades, Hippocrates, Minos, rival lovers, Thegas, Clitophon, sometimes seen as authentic but debatable. So these are some of the dialogues that comes under the writings of Socrates as doubtful authenticity. So there's some other doubtful works. Some scholars accept but others doubt are the dialogues like Alcibiades, which often accepted but not by all. Menexenus, which is a mock funeral oration style, is suspicious. Epinomus, likely by a student, maybe Philip of Opus, who had edited Laws. Letters, the epistles, especially the famous seventh letter, some argue authenticity there and others see it as forged. So why there is doubt, or why are these dialogues called as dialogues of doubtful authenticity? So basically there are these four dialogues: the early dialogues of Socrates, Plato, the middle dialogues of Socrates, Plato, the late dialogues, that is when Socrates had or rather Plato had written when Socrates was really at his deathbed, and then the dialogues of doubtful authenticity. These dialogues of doubtful authenticity is so addressed because for the style and vocabulary differ from Plato's core works. Philosophical content doesn't always align with Plato's doctrines, and ancient testimony is divided on some of them. So chronologically, if we are to give a list, we can say that early dialogues or the Socratic period, these dialogues were short, aphoretic, that is, it ends without conclusion, and close to Socrates' style. Some of them are apology, where Socrates' defense speech is noted. The Crito, it talks about justice, obedience to law. Euthyphro, about pity. Charmides, where it talks about temperance. Laches talks about courage. We also have Lysis that talks about friendship, Hippias Minor that talks about lying and virtue, Hippias Major that talks about beauty, authenticity debated but often included here. We talk about Ion, which is poetry and inspiration, Protagoras about virtue and whether it can be taught, Gorgias about rhetoric, justice. Now, when we talk about the middle dialogues, the Platonic period, we have the systematic doctrines, which were the theory of forms, immortality of the soul, and the philosopher king. Some of these middle dialogues were Meno, where knowledge as recollection, virtue, Phaedo, where soul's immortality or forms are mentioned, Symposium, love and ascent to the form of beauty, Republic, justice, ideal state, philosopher kings, form of the goods, Phaedrus, love, rhetoric, soul, forms, Cratylus, language and reality. Further, the late dialogues or the critical or the analytical period, we see that these dialogues were more technical, analytical, critiques earlier dialogues and focuses on metaphysics, logic and politics. Some of these are like Parmenides that critiques of the form, Theaetetus who talks about what is knowledge, Sophists, nature of being and not being, defining the sophist, statesman, politicus, nature of the true leader, Philebus talks about pleasure, knowledge and the good life, Timaeus talks about cosmology, creation of the universe. Critias talks about unfinished story of Atlantis. Laws talks about a second best state or the practical legislation. Eponymous talks about it says that sometimes it is added but authenticity doubtful, likely by fillers of opus. And last but not the least, the dialogues of doubtful authenticity, where these works attributed to Plato but in antiquity but likely written by others, such as Alcibiades, where it's sometimes accepted but sometimes doubted. Alcibiades 2, it is likely spurious. Cleitophon, authentically debated. Short dialogue criticizing Socrates. Hippocrates, likely spurious. Minos, again likely spurious. Theages, again spurious. Erexias, spurious. Rival lovers, again it is considered spurious. Menexenus, the funeral oration, some doubt its authenticity, and the letters was considered as the spurious. So we see the early dialogues where Socrates is questioning ethical concepts and there are no final answers. Middle dialogues where Plato's own doctrines, the forms, the soul, politics, love are mentioned or deliberated upon. And the late dialogues have been largely critical, logical, technical. Epistemology, cosmology, laws, metaphysics have been their broad theme. And last but not the least, dialogues of doubtful authenticity traces the ancient tradition, preserved them, but the style content suggested doesn't seem like Plato's work. So this was the crux of our Middle Greek philosophy today, where we have picked up the three giants of Greek philosophy, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. And the beauty of this tripartite giants have been that each has been a disciple of the former. So this is a living trend or a living legacy that continues to inspire us to mold our conceptions, our thoughts even today. And whatever the Western philosophy has been, as W.N. Whitehead had said as a footnote, that it is a continuation of Greek philosophy. So whatever the Western philosophy is about is in a way an extension of Greek philosophy. So today we have discussed about the features of Middle Greek philosophy, and we have introduced Middle Greek philosophy in this lecture. Thank you so much.